Hello everybody and welcome to Queen Mary University of London School of Law. I'm Penny Green, I'm the head of the law school here at Queen Mary, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today for Cry the Beloved Country, George Floyd and America's Continuing Racial Tragedy. This virtual one-hour round table will centre on police brutality, structural racial inequalities, inequities in our criminal justice systems, both in the UK and in the US, and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of colour. Questions will be invited at the end, and I will ask you at the end to use the chat function, but only at the end. Please don't use the chat function whilst our speakers are speaking. This is an extremely important round table, and we are really proud to host it because I think that, like all universities around the world, we need to address in a more significant way that we have already all of the questions that are raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm not going to spend much time now because we've got quite a full agenda, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Professor Penelope Andrews. Penny is the current president of the Law and Society Association. She's a faculty member at New York Law School, where she teaches constitutional law, torts and comparative law. And she's also a Queen Mary University of London HSS Distinguished Visiting Professor. She also serves as co-director of New York Law School's Racial Justice Project and host of the South Africa Reading Group. Professor Andrews previously completed 2 terms as Dean, as the first Black Dean at the University of Cape Town Faculty of Law, and as the first female Dean of Albany Law School in New York. She's a real pioneer. She's also editor of the International Journal of Law in Context, the Human Rights and the Global Economy e-journal, and the African Law e-journal. She's also published several books and articles that focus on comparative constitutional law, gender and racial equality, human rights, the judiciary and legal education. Professor Kendall Thomas has taught at Columbia University, where he is the Nash Professor of Law and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture. Professor Thomas teaches and writes about constitutional law, law and culture, law, gender, sexuality, and critical race theory. In addition to numerous contributions to journals and essay collections across law and several other disciplines, he's a co-editor of Critical Race Theory, Key Writings that Founded the Movement, What's Left of Theory, and The Legacy of Brown v. Board of Education, Reflections and Colloquy. An activist educator, Thomas is a past chair of the Jurisprudence and Law and Humanities sections of the Association of American Law Schools, and a founding member of the Majority Action Caucus of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, as well as of Amend the 13th, a grassroots constitutional change movement in the US to end prison slavery that is led by formerly incarcerated activists. Our third speaker is Professor Kirk Burkhalter. He's a professor of law at New York Law School. He teaches legal practice, criminal law, introduction to the MEE and MBE, has taught the School of Law's extended version of the Summer Advantage Institute, and is one of co-teachers of race, bias and advocacy. Professor Burkhalter has also assisted in the development of and taught in the school's undergraduate pre-law program, and this is a program designed to provide students from underrepresented populations with a dedicated set of opportunities to explore the law and create a pathway to earn their law degrees at New York Law School. Prior to joining the New York Law School faculty, he was visiting assistant professor of academic support at Hofstra School of Law. He's also taught as an adjunct at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Before working in academia, he was an associate in the Corporate Securities and Finance Practice Group at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman LLP. And he also, interestingly, served 20 years in the New York City Police Department, retiring as a detective first grade. He spent the majority of his career with the NYPD, conducting long-term investigations into organized criminal enterprises and domestic, ecological and industrial terrorism. Our final speaker is Dr. Tanzil Chowdhury, who's a lecturer in public law in the Department of Law at Queen Mary. He's also the co-founder of the Northern Police Monitoring Project, an independent grassroots organisation that supports individuals, families and communities that face police brutality and criminalisation. Tanzil has also been working with civil liberties and campaign groups to provide legal information to Black Lives Matter protesters across the UK. Tanzil has a forthcoming chapter on policing and the colonial boomerang, in a forthcoming edited collection on abolishing the police, as well as a monograph with Routledge out in July entitled Time, Temporality and Legal Judgment. So we have a fantastic lineup, as you can see. I'm going to hand over to them, but first, can I ask you to leave your videos and microphones on mute and use the chat function only to ask questions once all the speakers have spoken. Speakers will speak for between 10 and 12 minutes and in the order that I've introduced them, and then we'll then move to questions and comments. Thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you have an extremely interesting roundtable. Over to Penny.
Thank you, Professor Green, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important seminar. Before I start, let me thank Ms. Goulge Cartoon for arranging this event, as well as Ms. Christine Stokes. And then, of course, I'm delighted that my fellow panelists could join me. I'm going to just make some preliminary remarks and also just focus on two issues. One is the sort of reforms, the law reforms that have evolved in response to the protests, and then talk a little bit about how public attitudes in the United States have responded to Black Lives Matter. But the title of the panel, Cry the Beloved Country, is something I suggested. It's based on the iconic book of Alan Paton, set during apartheid South Africa, and the pathos of that country's balancing of pain and hope. And I think that in the United States, we are now sort of looking at the hope of change and reform and the pain that we are currently experiencing. The Law and Society Association actually held a panel, a plenary session at our meeting earlier this month, in which we looked at the police brutality. We looked at the devastating impact of the criminal justice system on African Americans in the United States, particularly racial profiling, the disproportionate imprisonment of African American men. We spoke about police training, police reform, funding, and exploring alternatives to the current model of policing in the United States. Now, the plenary and this panel, of course, occurs against the backdrop of the pandemic in the world and in the United States, where we've been in lockdown since early March. But what has surfaced in the statistics around the pandemic and the infections and death rates of COVID-19, we've seen in the United States that the impact has been disproportionate on African Americans. So, for example, in a report by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, it was noted that among COVID deaths in New York, for example, the numbers were almost double to those, the deaths and infection rates were almost double to those of white Americans. Similarly, in Louisiana, for example, in New Orleans, where African Americans make up something like 33% of the population, they accounted very early on for 70% of the deaths. So the recent murder of George Floyd intersects with COVID-19 and the pandemic, and as I said, its disparate impact on African Americans. Now, George Floyd's death also occurred, you know, in sort of the wake of a few other killings of African Americans in the United States. So, for example, in April, there 2 deaths occurred which were significant before George Floyd's killing. A 25-year-old African American man, Ahmaud Arbery, was jogging in a suburb in Georgia, and he was shot and killed. In Kentucky, Breonna Taylor was killed by police in a no-knock warrant. And then, of course, what we saw with the murder of George Floyd was its being recorded and streamlined across the world, and what people saw was essentially a 9-minute event in which the police officer, in the most incredible display of impunity, with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, really exhibiting a version, as I said, of impunity that's been the hallmark in many ways of aspects of American policing. So it is almost as Charles Blow, the New York Times columnist, has said about the protests. He says that people are marching as a way of screaming, a way of exhaling pain. It's an enormous group catharsis. So it's not only about the pain of police brutality, as Charles Blow explains, but it's about all the pain. It's about the disrespect and the oppression and the injustice. And this is what Charles says, it's about ancestry and progeny. So we're watching history unfold here, and the question is will this be a history of change, or will this be a history of indifference? So will these momentous events, which have happened for almost a month, will it lead to substantive changes, or are we going to see a result of some symbolic changes? But I think that I'm hopeful, because what I've seen in response to the protests and this exhaling in the United States by both Black Americans and other Americans has been two things that I just want to focus on. The first is the legislative responses. So across the country, we've seen state legislatures pass a series of police reforms. And these reforms include banning chokeholds and opening up police disciplinary records. This has been what has been done, for example, in New York. The Kentucky legislature passed a law which outlawed no-knock warrants. And then also the Iowa legislature, for example, passed a police reform bill to ban chokeholds and to address officer misconduct. Even the president eventually signed an executive order, which was a little bit watered down, but really did acknowledge police brutality and violence against African Americans. So there's a statistics, for example, that shows that the police killed 1,004 people in 2019. Black people make up 24% of the make up 13% of the population, but were 24% of those killed. So the legislative responses are, for me, quite hopeful. The United States House of Representatives passed the Justice in Policing Act. It's quite a comprehensive act that still has to be passed by the Senate. But if the bill is passed, it will lead to greater police accountability. It will look at the system of qualified immunity, which immunizes police officers when they engage in criminal or reckless conduct. The bill provides for investigation of police officers. And then also a very, very important part of the bill, it sets up some kind of registry so that it ensures that police officers don't move. Police officers who've been dismissed or have been sanctioned do not move to other jurisdictions because there is no registry to actually keep tabs on them. So the legislative reforms across the country have been fairly significant, and as I said, it is quite hopeful. And one of the other things that it will require, and I know my colleague Professor Burkhalter will talk about this, it will require mandatory training of the police to end bias and racial profiling. But what has also been very interesting, and this is my second point just in the last few minutes, my second point has really been to see how the energy of the society across the board in the United States have responded to the protests. So we know, for example, that legislative reforms are of limited value if there's not the political will to implement and enforce them. We know, for example, that the African Americans are still struggling to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 implemented and still to pursue rights under the Civil Rights Act. But what has, so the legislative reforms have been important, but society, civil society, businesses, and many influential Americans have actually come out and expressed their support for Black Lives Matter. We've also seen the statistics, the surveys show that more and more Americans believe that African Americans are disproportionately profiled by the police. They believe that there's unfairness in the criminal justice system. They believe that there's unfairness in policing and so on. And the murder of George Floyd has been particularly alarming and has really sort of almost awoken Americans, non-Black Americans, to what has gone on. So there's been a shift in the public response and the public perceptions of what is going on in the United States and why people are protesting in these huge numbers. And two key areas of the United States that I think are important, again, which gives me hope, is the response that have come towards Black Lives Matter in the sporting arena and in the entertainment business. And you've seen that, you know, various symbolic and substantive changes have happened in those arenas. Most significantly, the American Bar Association, if you go to their website, you'll see the range of activities that they are dedicating to this question of racial inequality in policing and the criminal justice system, and bar associations across the country are doing this. There's also a large discussion in the educational institutions in law schools and universities across the United States. Now, of course, the big question remains, will this all lead to lasting change? And I think that the rubber will meet the road in November when Americans can go to the poll and can determine whether they will elect a leader with inclusive values and is committed to an inclusive project, particularly an inclusive racial and economic project, or if the status quo is to remain. I am particularly hopeful. As I said, I've seen in many instances of the call for change. The protests have been persistent. They've been across all 50 states. They even have global resonance. And I think that this will, for me, hopefully, this will be more sustaining than previous attempts and previous civil rights struggles. So I'll hand this over now to Professor Kendall Thomas.
Thank you very much, Dean Andrews, and thank you as well to Dean Green and to the Queen Mary School of Law community for providing us with this forum to discuss this very important set of questions that have been raised by Penelope Andrews and this incarnation of the discussion, Cry the Beloved Country, George Floyd and America's racial tragedy. I want to start by thinking about this question of tragedy and its application to the American context. My mind goes, in the first instance, to Aeschylus and to the lines from the great tragedy Agamemnon, in which Aeschylus famously wrote that wisdom comes through suffering, which I learned as a student of literature through the translation. Through suffering, we learn, except when we don't. And so I want to start where Penny ended by really focusing on the question of whether, and if so, what lessons Americans are going to take from these recent killings, and the killing, of course, which culminated in the death of George Floyd. Aeschylus wrote, too, that nothing forces us to know what we do not want to know except pain. And I do think it's true that in the United States, white Americans in particular have been forced out of the privilege, a privilege which many of them didn't even know they had, the privilege of unknowing, which is a function of what the legal scholar Barbara Flagg calls white racial transparency, which is the term she gave to describe the social fact here in the United States that most of the time, in most places, most white people simply do not have to think about the fact that they're white or that they have a race at all. And that existential reality, I think, has blinded many Americans throughout the country of European descent to the lived experience of African Americans and to the extent to which that experience has been defined by pain. I'm sitting in my apartment in Harlem, and I was telling Penny earlier this morning that as I think about these past few weeks, both the arrival of spring and the arrival of summer, which we have lived through largely in confinement, have been marked by a kind of soundtrack of Black pain, or of pain that has been disproportionately Black and brown here in New York and in many other parts of the country. The weekend that the spring season began, we New Yorkers suddenly started hearing the sound of ambulance sirens. And it was a symphony of sirens, which began early in the morning and continued late into the evening, of people being brought to hospitals all over the city, people who had gotten sick as a result of the coronavirus. And then this past week, there has been a nightly bombardment throughout the city, but particularly in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, of fireworks, of industrial fireworks, to which private residents, private citizens in the city have somehow gotten access. Late, I started to say late last night, but in fact it was early this morning at 3:45 from my window. It was so close I felt I could touch it. I saw the kinds of fireworks that we typically only see here in the United States on July 4th, our so-called Independence Day, when we celebrate the declaration of the 13 colonies of their independence from England. And so the combined effect of this, and I'm speaking to you after sleeping maybe 3 hours overnight, the combined effect of this, I think, has been a shock to our political nervous system. We are feeling in our bodies the reality that the United States at this current moment in our national life is a republic of suffering, of pain and death, in which these two epidemics of COVID-19 and police beating and shooting of our loved ones and friends have converged to really produce what many of us believe is nothing short of a civil society rebellion led by Black and brown people, but defined importantly by an emerging multiracial, multi-ethnic, intergenerational coalition. So for me, the question is, how are we to think about this moment? What lessons do we take from this moment? And what do we do with this moment? And I've been thinking a lot about the opportunity that this moment in the United States offers us to shift from the dominant way we have in this country thought about questions of race and racism. Throughout most of our history, in our law and in our politics, Americans have talked about questions of racism and racial injustice in moral terms. We conceive racism in terms of individual bias, or the language we use is of individual discrimination by one person against another. We think of racial discrimination as a discrete, an insular, an episodic, and indeed even an aberrant betrayal of an otherwise colorblind, race-neutral, legal, political, and economic order. And many Americans think that the essential harm of racism is its failure to acknowledge the individuality and the full moral personhood of Black and brown people. Thus, the liberal legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin talks about equal concern and respect within a liberal, radically individual conception, both of racial injustice and the remedy for racial injustice. And this moralism, it seems to me, has been a stumbling block, not just to our thinking about racism, but to our willingness to address it as a society. And I believe it's time to abandon once and for all this moral conception of what racism is and its focus on the individual, the preoccupation with prejudice or implicit bias or the bad attitudes of individual actors. Consider the street rebellion against police violence that's been taking place in the streets of this country during the past month. For those who've been willing to listen, it seems to me that the protests organized by the Movement for Black Lives provide a national seminar on the foundational role that institutional and structural racism have played in shaping policing and police policy in the United States. This institutional perspective doesn't disregard the psychic life of power or the fact that racism quite obviously operates through individuals and through individual agency. What it recognizes, however, is that those attitudes, that bias, that prejudice is shaped, informed, and sustained by institutions and the ideology that those institutions elaborate and disseminate throughout the broader culture. Thus, the leaders of the Movement for Black Lives and the coalition of movements that have come together to stage these unprecedented and energizing protests have focused on the goal of ending police killing, not by talking about the problem of a few dirty cops or a few bad police departments. The Movement for Black Lives understands that the problem is not merely punitive policing, but rather what we constitutional lawyers call the police power itself. And the police power state, which from its inception has made the violent taking of Black and brown life part of the essential work of policing in America. The demand of the movement, in short, is not merely to stop discriminating on the basis of race, to quote Supreme Court Justice Roberts, but rather to dismantle the legal, political, and economic architecture of anti-Black and anti-brown racial domination and dominion by whites as a social group. Black and brown people in this country know that the police power, which is a name that we use in this country to describe really the power of sovereignty, the power of the government to govern citizens and things within its dominion, to quote the 19th century Chief Justice Roger Taney. Black people know that the essential problem of the Republic of Pain in which we live is that policing, punitive policing, has occupied the entire field of what we constitutional lawyers call police power. That is to say, most Black and brown people from their lived experience, know that people in our communities have as their first, and in some instances, only point of contact with the law and the state itself through the practice of punitive policing in our communities. And so that institutional perspective has given rise to a demand by these movements to defund the police. And I'd like, in my remaining moments, to talk about that, because I spent much of this past week drafting a letter to the New York City Council to support proposed legislation that would defund the police and refund the people by taking $1 billion from the New York Police Department budget and reallocating that money in programs and policies that will truly advance community safety and security. The defund the police debate really has captured much of the attention of the media during the week, and opponents of the movement have tried to deflect attention from the campaign to abolish the police power and the police power state as we know it. They refuse to address the crisis of policing and police violence in any serious or substantive way, and have instead tried to distract from the mounting body count of our loved ones and community members who have died at the hands of the police by muddying the conversation. They've seized predictably on the language the movement has used to demand an end to police violence and to laws and customs that have permitted the police to kill with impunity. But quibbles over the word defunding shouldn't blind us to two fundamental truths that the current crisis has thrown in stark relief. I noted earlier one of these, namely that if Black Lives Matter, we can no longer deny that the violent taking of Black and brown life we see today has always been part of the essential work of policing in this country. The police in this country were formed to, in the first instance, to police the lives of people of African descent who were enslaved. So historically, there is a constitutive connection between policing in this country and indeed the police power itself and anti-Black racism and anti-Black violence. Second, we need to stop pretending that the policing of African-American communities, criminalization, surveillance, harassment, imprisonment, and death has no connection to the massive investment over many decades in punitive policing in the United States. Here are a few facts. Robert Reich in the Guardian newspaper, in an op-ed published yesterday, argues that Donald Trump is the culmination of 40 years of increasing social control in the US and decreasing social investment. Spending on policing in the United States has almost tripled from $42.3 billion in 1977 to $114.5 billion in 2017. America now locks away 2.2 million people. That's an increase of 500% from 40 years ago. The US has the largest incarcerated population in the world, and you will not be surprised to know that people of color, African Americans in particular, are overrepresented in the jails and prison populations of this country. Immigration and customs enforcement has exploded. More people are now in ICE detention than ever in its history.
1 minute, Kendall, sorry.
So we have come to the conclusion that this lavish spending on the policing of Black and brown communities that starves these same communities of decent housing, healthcare, education, and other basic public goods means that no serious response to the problem of police violence in our society will occur without a fundamental shift in priorities and an historic redeployment of money and material resources. So the problem is not a moral one, but a political one. And it is a political problem, not just in terms of our law, as Penny was discussing earlier, but in terms of our political economy. So we in New York have supported the movement call to defund the police and to pursue a fundamental change in the investments in our communities by calling for a $1 billion cut from the New York Police Department budget in fiscal year 2021. We support this call because the demand to defund the police is a declaration of our democratic right as community members to wrest the power to commit violence away from the police. So we support the call for reinvestment into the welfare of our communities and for reimagining of our relationship to public safety. We are embracing a democratic vision of human justice that moves beyond the punitive state-centered preoccupation with police, jails, and prisons, and other blunt tools for safety and justice. So a post-punitive policy that redistributes resources freed up by shrinking police budgets will promote both the security and the safety of our communities. We need this increase in funding to meet the human needs that have been denied to our communities for too long. And we also need, by the way, greater public investment in community-based violence reduction and intervention programs, alternative sentencing, and restorative justice practices that seek repair instead of retribution. Yes, the goal of defunding is to make policing as we know it an unnecessary relic of the past, and to pursue a policy that democratizes decision-making about community safety and security by vesting the power to decide not only what the law will be, but where we will commit our public funds and material resources. So this call to defund the police and refund the people reimagines the possibilities of the police power and shifts to a post-punitive policing paradigm that the street rebellions, it seemed to me, are in the vanguard of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move now to Kirk Burkhalter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Green. Thank you for that marvelous introduction. Perhaps you could travel with me and introduce me everywhere, but that was tremendous. And thank you to the Queen Mary School of Law. This is a tremendous program. And of course, thank you to my colleague and friend, Professor Andrews. So, you know, there were several questions raised here and interesting topics. So I first would like to answer Professor Andrews' question about where, what do we see for the future, and how will history record what has occurred here? And I will say that I am cautiously hopeful, and I will return to that answer at the end of my remarks. So let me preface my discussion and my approach to this topic by something that Professor Thomas touched on. This is a problem. It's not a police problem. It's a problem about race. And we are not going to cure what ails our law enforcement community until we cure the original sin of this particular country, as well as beyond our borders. So the call to arms here for me is cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war against racism, because that is the outcrop of the original sin, the enslavement of Black persons and the colonialism that permeated the world in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. This is what we are living with. And until we deal with these issues, we will never be able to move forward. So why do I take that position? Well, where do the police come from? This police officer that killed George Floyd, each and every police officer that we've seen on every video that has taken the life of a Black person, where do they come from? Well, they are the people that live in our communities. They are the brothers and the sisters and the mothers and the fathers and the daughters. There is no tree that we go to that we can pluck these perfect police officers from. They come from society. And what we see playing out in our law enforcement community is a reflection of what ails society. So that's not to say it's a non-starter to work on these issues directly surrounding law enforcement. However, they'll never catch hold. They will never take hold until we cure what is wrong with society. I agree with Professor Thomas. I think he makes an excellent point that I've always felt the moralism argument is a non-starter. I can't convince you to like me because it's the right thing to do. I can't convince anyone to like anyone. However, it is an argument. It's not even an argument. It is an edict that all people have certain rights. They have moral rights, and under the law and under the Constitution and under the various state constitutions and local laws, all folks have rights. So you don't have to like someone. You just have to understand that it is illegal and unconstitutional to call the police on them because they are walking while black, ordering coffee while black, driving while black, bird watching while black, living while black. That's unconstitutional. So that's the starting point. Having people understand that this is a right. It is the right to live, the right to exist. The argument is not that black people want something better than what other folks have. They want to be treated fairly, and that is a God-given right. So once we correct all that ills with racism, we can move on to the police. And you know, my vision of how to approach what ails policing in the United States is twofold. The first being how we educate police officers. We need to throw out the book and start over. And the second being we need to reimagine how we deliver police services, law enforcement services. So starting with the education piece, and I purposely do not use the word training. I think the word training is more appropriate when we train law enforcement personnel for use of their firearms, perhaps how to hit a target, on other limited areas such as operating a motor vehicle. But for the overall parameters of that job, it's about education, because training, generally speaking, is teaching someone to respond to a particular set of stimuli. So there's no training in the world that can teach a person to respond to every other person they may encounter in society, in every situation they may encounter in society while policing the streets of this country. However, we can educate people, meaning providing them with comprehensive information that will promote deep thinking and reflection and far better and comprehensive decision-making. So right now, the requirements, well, let's take New York, for instance. The police academy here in New York City, where I live, lasts for anywhere from 5 to 6 months. However, what's amazing is if one wants to be licensed as a barber to cut hair in the state of New York, the requirement is that you undergo a year of training. So it actually takes 6 months longer to become a barber in New York State than it does to become a police officer. Yet, I don't think a barber is someone who's taking the life of another in their hands every single day when they put on a uniform and go out to patrol the streets. So what would this new educational requirement look like? Well, I would say it would be akin to some form of undergraduate degree, perhaps a very specialized police science degree. Police officers, recruits, would spend 2 years in an academy instead of 5 to 6 months. First and foremost, it gives the police department 2 years to examine this person, understand their decision-making process, to really understand whether or not this job is suited for them, or whether they are suited for this job, whether they are suited to go out into society and enforce the laws. Very difficult to hide for 2 years. Second, police officers and recruits obviously would be educated in sociology, psychology, not just psychology generally speaking, but small group psychology, interpersonal dynamics, anthropology, the study and understanding of what makes us human, conflict resolution, negotiation, history, American history and global history. Why global history? Well, if you look at the United States, and in particular where I live in New York, we have representatives from so many cultures all across the globe. How can one not understand who people are and where they come from and how they came to be, and without taking a course in some form of global history, and let alone American history? Yes, let's study those chapters that for many years, certainly while I was growing up in middle school and high school and so forth, were omitted from textbooks, but that are now there. So police officers are more apt to understand the history of enslaved persons in this country and the vestiges of such, and the civil rights movement. So I would envision that this, and in addition to obviously all the firearms training, the tactics trainings and so forth, I would certainly envision this would, this academy should last for a longer period. Second, as it stands now in most jurisdictions, police officers do all the training in police academies. And I certainly think there is some benefit to having those who have done a particular job trained. However, think about the subjects I just mentioned, and we have some of the greatest minds in the world within the borders of the United States. And you can say the same about any country. Why are these folks not involved in training? First benefit is their knowledge base is far superior than the average instructor who would provide instruction on psychology and so forth. You know, you're just kind of randomly hoping that some police officer has a PhD in one of these topics. Second, from day one, it would teach police officers, and they would be used to working with a civilian population. This us against them attitude is something that has permeated law enforcement for years, long before I was even born. And part of that is because the indoctrination process, which lasts 6 months to, of training, and then another 6 months of while you're out on the street, they call it field training, but it's actually your first assignment. You're surrounded by nothing but police officers. Civilians are effectively cut out of your life, other than family members and close friends. And quite often you just end up not associating with your close friends that you knew prior to becoming a police officer, because you have this new group of friends. So by indoctrinating, or should I rather including civilians in the training, hopefully that would in some way, shape, or form start to mitigate this us against them mentality. Further, these officers would be educated. They would be released into the street after maybe 6 months, perform police duties and functions for about a month or so, come back for more education, time for reflection, and most importantly, evaluation. And this process would be repeated over that remaining 1.5-year period where their education would be continued. So I think that would be a drastic change, and you would change the mindset at the beginning. One of my students reminded me in a conversation last week, bend the tree while it's young. It's very difficult to bend an oak, but you plant the seed and bend it while it's young. You can kind of get the tree to grow how you want. Second, I would recommend the creation of an executive academy. An executive academy would mean that we would hire the captains and precinct commanders and so forth directly into that rank, rather than hoping that we have police officers that grow up through the ranks and turn into those executives. If you want someone to be a leader, hire them as a leader and train them. We've seen this model over and over in the various military academies throughout the world. Now, I know I'm running out of time here, but I wanted to touch on the delivery of police services. So, as Professor Thomas mentioned, there certainly has been a tremendous call for a defunding of the police. And I would like to see that conversation turn to, and we touched on it, into a reallocation of resources and a reimagining of how those resources are delivered. Right now, in every jurisdiction, there's this one unit, a precinct or a parish, whatever you want to call it. It's a building that's responsible for the delivery of police services for a very select, discrete geographical area. And those are all uniform personnel. Well, I would re-envision that as a combination of uniformed personnel and civilian personnel. And instead of having a police commander, there would be a counterpart of a civilian person in charge, and they would work together where neither is actually in charge. So along with these uniform services, you would also have a myriad of social services. And these folks would not live somewhere downtown in some centralized area. They would live within the precinct, so they could respond with police officers to domestic incidents involving youth, the mentally ill. We see tremendous abuse of mentally ill persons by law enforcement because they're simply not trained. I think that people are always going to call 911. It's going to take a massive culture change for folks not to call 911. I'm not going to get in an argument with my spouse, and perhaps we have a physical altercation. I'm not going to call 911 and say, hey, I just had a physical altercation with my spouse. Could you please send a social worker? However, when I do call 911, the police department can be smart enough to send the police along with a social worker, along with victim services. We should have legal aid and district attorneys assigned to very specific precincts, so we don't have incidents of this re-victimization of persons like George Floyd and others, where the first where they're first a victim of police abuse, and then this has to work its way throughout a system, and 10, 12 days later, someone decides that perhaps because a video came out, there's enough evidence to bring charges. No. If we house all these services in this one geographical unit, I think that we can more effectively service our communities. So I certainly would like to see a reallocation of funds in that respect. I'm also finally, just 2 points. One, I'm a little paranoid. I don't trust folks. If I trusted them, we wouldn't have this problem already. So if we are going to reallocate funds to other services outside the police department, I want a plan and I want to know where they go, because there are a lot of hands in the pot. The second point I wanted to make was Professor Andrews finally mentioned how will history see us. I'm cautiously hopeful, because a turning point in the civil rights movement in the United States was when the film, various news agencies captured the horrendous abuse that protesters suffered when hoses were turned on them and dogs were turned on them and so forth. And many Americans, while they kind of knew it, they couldn't ignore it once they saw it. And this was somewhat of a turning point. And I think that's what we're seeing here. These videos are impossible to ignore. They just simply won't go away. So hopefully this won't be a footnote in a case book or an opening paragraph, and then we'll learn about the other important stuff. No, maybe this will hopefully 50 years from now be one chapter in a case book, if not many, or maybe there will be a case book on this entire topic, or in a perfect world, every case book would integrate everything that we're discussing here: the history of racism, the vestiges of slavery, the vestiges of colonialism, the history of the over-abuse of the authority of law enforcement, because it does touch every aspect of the law. So I believe, and if my stopwatch is correct, my time is up. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Burkhalter. That was terrific. And now I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, Dr. Tanzil Chowdhury.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Penny and Ghosh and Christine for bringing us all together, including my esteemed colleagues from New York. So policing has been an enduring feature of UK race making and racialisation in the UK. And by this I also mean to include the period before the historic migrations of former colonial subjects, mainly from the Caribbean and Asia, to the UK metropole. Therefore, to understand the connections between UK policing and race, we can't just look at the UK, but we have to look at its former global empire. Now, critical histories of UK policing, in particular the formation of the Metropolitan Police in the UK, relate, quote, the rise of professional policing to the conjunctural crisis of early capitalism and the desire of the state to pacify an emergent industrial working class. Now, while this account is partially correct, such accounts often suffer from a provincialisation of the UK and the erasure of its imperial entanglements. Governance in its colonies, protectorates, mandates, dominions across Asia, Africa, the Americas and the Middle East meant that policing in the UK not just constituted policing in the colonies, but was also constituted by it. And so UK policing and its practices of race making are the product of what Ames Césaire and George Padmore and others have more generally described as a colonial boomerang. But I start not in India or the Middle East, but in the UK's oldest settler colony of quote-unquote Northern Ireland, which provided an important space for the logistical and strategic experimentation of racialisation and the policing of dissent and anti-colonial resistance. Now, this was then transported back into, reconfigured and normalised in the UK, especially in its policing of racialised communities. Importantly, in order to manufacture consent, particularly on the British mainland, the Royal Irish Constabulary engaged in a concerted campaign against the indigenous Irish population, framing them as a perpetual threat to British imperial interests of capital accumulation. Was no different, or was little different from the kind of productions of racial regimes, techniques, and practices of imperialism elsewhere. As Patrick Wolfe writes, when colonisers are threatened with the requirement to share social space, racialisation describes a process in which the colonisers impose classificatory grids on local populations to coordinate particular ends. Indeed, race is colonialism speaking. Now, Orientalisation was key, and so the Irish's quote-unquote wild shamrock manners needed to be policed and placated. Sir Robert Peel, the founder of the modern Metropolitan Police, once described the Irish and their, quote, natural predilection for outrage and lawless life as something he thought couldn't be controlled. Irish communities were identified as what Paddy Hilliard famously referred to as suspect communities, and would legitimate the use of exceptional powers put in place by the state to police and dominate these communities. The twirling boomerang effect of policing in Northern Ireland was to have a direct consequence in the UK. One example is that Sir Robert Peel, considered one of the key progenitors of the London Metropolitan Police in 1829, had also served as Chief Secretary in Ireland and was an officer in the British Mandate of Palestine. What policing in Northern Ireland brought to the UK was a militarisation in the practice and operationalisation of policing to the urban cities, rationalised through an orientalising discourse directed against diaspora populations, often in the service of accumulation, and hence a durability emerges of colonial relations into the current conjecture. What Stephen Green refers to as inner city Orientalism similarly constructs diaspora communities and communities of colour from Brick Lane to Moss Side, Brixton to Chapeltown or Tottenham as gangsters or terrorists. Now, Gilroy's writing on the connections between national decline and race is instructive here. He writes how, quote, unified national culture articulated around the theme of legality and constitution is alleged to have been violated by black criminality, illustrating how this disrupts the obedience for law and the ubiquitous threat to the British culture that blackness poses. This internal Orientalism is often articulated through various panics. So we have what Stuart Hall famously wrote about, the mugging panic to the Black Party, or the pervasiveness of so-called knife crime and its alleged concomitancy with Brixton-born drill music. These provide new rationalities for the military urbanism in such communities, and so the quote-unquote low-intensity wars of the Troubles in Northern Ireland re-emerge through suspicionless stop and searches of Muslims at airports and the preventive logics of the Prevent programme, or the intersection of the gangs matrix and the joint enterprise laws that criminalise groups of young black men, or the shoot-to-kill policies which have killed John Charlton Menezes, Ezell Rodney, Mark Duggan, Anthony Granger, or the general normalisation of the armed police. I want to briefly focus on how racist policing is articulated through one particular police power of stop and search. So last year, according to the Home Office statistics, you are 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black than white. According to the report, The Colour of Injustice, published by the drug charity Release in 2019, black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite using drugs at a lower rate than white people. Now, it's important to note a few things here. Stop and searches resulted in very few, and I mean very few, successful convictions. A recent paper in the British Journal of Criminology found that stop and searches had a very, very small, almost negligible effect on crime prevention. And so this begs the question, what is stop and search actually for? Secondly, racial disparity or racial policing has actually doubled since 1999, the same year that the Macpherson report declared the Metropolitan Police institutionally racist after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. And despite a decrease in the disproportionately high stop and searches against black people, they have risen again in the previous year. Now, how is this all kind of enacted or rematerialized during COVID? Now, a good place to start is the report published by Public Health England, which provided a review of disparities in the risk and outcomes of COVID-19. It shows that there is an association between belonging to certain ethnic groups and the likelihood of testing positive and dying from COVID-19. Given also the space that we inhabit as QMUL workers, it's also important to note that people of Bangladeshi ethnicity had around twice the risk of death when compared to their white counterparts. We all may also be familiar with the story of Belly Majinga, a black woman who worked as a railway ticket officer who died of coronavirus after being spat at while on duty. Now, as stark and as horrible as this report is, we shouldn't really be surprised. Pandemics reproduce already existing inequalities of racial capitalism, which invests in the production of racialized and gendered difference. Importantly, however, pandemics often accelerate death and also social death, given the woeful absence of provisions available to sustain life. For example, ICU units, PPE equipment, etc., etc. But what about policing and race during COVID? Now, it's difficult to survey the entirety of the landscape. But some of the work that's been done by the investigative journalists from the human rights charity Liberty, Miriam Gidder, found that BAME people in England are 54% more likely to be fined under coronavirus regulations than white people. And in a later piece that she wrote, she said that data from police forces show that 17 are more likely to issue a penalty notice to BAME people than to white people. Now, I want to finish on trying to unravel what Black Lives Matter means for the UK. And I can summarise this in roughly 3 ways. The first is that it's beginning to visibilise the deaths that are caused at the hand of the tightening grips of the police. Sarah Reid, Sheikha Bayu, Azelle Rodney, Mark Duggan, Rashan Charles, Christopher Alder, Anthony Granger, Leon Patterson, Roger Sylvester, Rocky Bennett, Harry Stanley, Smiley Culture, Sarah Campbell, and many others. Note, despite the fact that there have been 1,700 deaths in police custody since the 1990s, not one officer has been charged. The last time an officer was charged was following the death of a black man, David Olawale, back in the late 1960s, where 2 racist police officers were charged with manslaughter, though they were only found guilty of assault. It's actually worth noting in this trial that the judge directed the jury not to find the defendant officers guilty of manslaughter and actually referred to Olawale as a dirty, filthy, violent vagrant. The felling of slave owner statues also speaks to the enduring legacies, afterlives, and rematerializations and articulations of British imperial power that we are increasingly having a national conversation about. Recently, Dr. Kodra Karam suggested setting up something like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee that may substantively confront those issues and provide some material solutions to them. The second important thing that the Black Lives Matter movement is significant for is to see this present moment not of its own making, but as a continuation of a sustained struggle against police and state violence that is necessarily connected to what has gone before. And I'm talking here about the 2011 riots in the UK, the Mossad riots in 1981, the Council Estate riots in Salford, the G8 protests, the Occupy movement to protest at Barton Moss, and I could go on. In recognising that the present moment isn't autarkic, we also do not flatten our analysis of what is happening in the US and the UK, instead seeing race and racialisation as a historically contingent process, a social relation that is actively produced and reproduced in different spaces and times. And of course, there are important similarities in what is happening on either side of the Atlantic, much of which has kind of strategic significance, but our analysis also has to recognise those differences of processes of race making. The third and final point is that I think we're beginning to see a new common sense around policing, though there is still significant work to be done. The problem with the current approach by the UK government, which is these kind of countless inquiries and reviews, is that they tend to perpetually defer justice. The problem with the kind of what we might call reformist reforms of the police, like body cameras, etc., unconscious bias training, is we may liken them to the critiques levelled at international humanitarian law, in that they merely provide a more humane way to kill and control racialised bodies and communities. Now, following the amazing calls to defund the police in Minneapolis, we are beginning to see, or certainly at least we will see, similar calls for what Angela Davis calls non-reformist reforms, or measures which reduce the scale, scope, power, authority, and legitimacy of criminalising institutions. Such call has been made by UK Black Lives Matter. But for this call to have any purchase and to form the new common sense, part of the conversation from social movements needs to continue. Part of that conversation needs to include unnaturalising both the police as an institution, but also policing. So this extends to functions of policing people and communities, which, for example, is extended to public sector workers in enacting the PREVENT programme. The social movements need to provide a sensible and reasonable path toward defunding the police, which could also include arguments or proposals to retraining current officers, similar to the way in which the Lucas plan identifies retraining people that work in the arms industry. They also have to make the argument for public health approaches, the decriminalisation of ways of survival, exploring transformative justice approaches that respond to tricky questions around stuff like domestic violence, for example. In other words, to quote the US's Abolition manifesto, we need to invest in care, not cops. And importantly, we need to make the argument for divestiture and the redirecting of funds. Youth services in the UK have been decimated by around about 69% in the last 10 years. And in Glasgow, recently, where they had some of the worst statistics around knife crime, a redirection of funds to youth services had a huge impact on knife crime reduction. And the task, therefore, is for social movements to make sensible abolition the new common sense. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tanzil, and many thanks to everybody on the panel. We've already got a few questions that are emerging, and so I think what I'll do is I will read out, unless you can see them on the chat, but the first question comes from Jen, and it's to everybody, and the questions are: how would you respond to the argument that acts of police violence and brutality are committed by a few bad apples? We know that's a very familiar claim, not so much at the moment, I think. And the second question from Jen is: what is your vision for police unions? Should they be abolished? The second question also takes up the question of police unions as organisations which enable police violence. And I wonder, so if we could take those two to start with, and then I'll come to the final two questions that we have at the moment.
May I jump in on the bad apples question?
Please do.
I'll be very quick. So because I hear this question all the time. So imagine if I had 7 children, God forbid, but if I had 7 children and 6 of those 7 children were angels. They carried groceries for all my neighbors and shoveled everybody's walk. But the 7th child was a little bit of a bad apple, right? He or she likes to set fires and actually burn down a few homes in the neighborhood. Would it be appropriate for me to say, well, 6 out of 7 is not bad at all? So number one, even a few bad apples, if that was true, even if there are a few bad apples and the result of not finding those folks and weeding them out was the death of others, that alone makes it unacceptable. Second, it's not a few bad apples. That goes back to my earlier comment that we are seeing a reflection of society. So therefore, if I could not accept that argument, based on what I said, so are there just a few bad apples in society? Well, clearly there are not, because we see other forms of racism that exist all throughout our society. So it's just simply a non-starter. It's not just a few bad apples by virtue of looking at society. And 2, even if there were, that does not relieve departments of the responsibility of weeding it out.
Thank you. Anybody else
Also,
want to come back?
yeah,
Penny?
I just want to, the few bad apples. Also, the problem is that even with, if we assume, and I do assume that not all cops are bad, it's the problem of enabling others. So this culture of policing, and this also ties into the question about police unions, is that there is a culture that enables people to, you know, carry out these atrocities. So for example, if you look at George Floyd, there were other police officers right there. So, and it may have to do with hierarchy and so on, but I think that is the problem, that you have to be able to have a measure of accountability within each individual officer, so that the bad apples themselves are not tolerated and their activities are not defended by police unions and so on. So it's a cultural thing.
Well, it's not just a cultural thing. It's also a question of economics and power, because I grew up in a union family, and I support the union movement. But it's clear that police unions in the United States have been, to borrow Professor Chowdhury's language, race-making projects, right? If policing is about race-making, so too are the affiliations among policemen across the United States. And there are real tensions in police departments that are multiracial between white cops, who are the cops who typically run the unions, and cops of color. Right? And the collective bargaining agreements have actually focused relentlessly on immunizing cops and protecting cops who are routinely engaging in brutal acts of violence in the communities that they police, through all kinds of procedural protections and support. And when you couple that internal law, right, which is a kind of private law, between the police officers and the municipalities with which they bargain, plus the very police-friendly case law that the courts have developed under our Constitution, which provide what we call in the case law qualified immunity to the police, you have a combination of legal protection and economic protections through collective bargaining and the union, which actually operates as an obstacle to accountability. Now, does that mean that unions should be abolished? I'm not prepared to say that they should, but I certainly think that their power ought to be reduced greatly, and the scope of issues with respect to which police officers are able to engage in collective bargaining should not allow what in effect provides a regime of legal protection for them that makes substantive police accountability impossible.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. The next one relates to, I'm sorry, it's jumping around a little bit. The evidence that the police officers have committed aided murder against George Floyd. Why are they able to be released on bail? If there's clear evidence, for example.
That's a, if I may, that's a great question. And I'm going to provide you with the answer, and keep in mind, you know, all answers are not created equally for all people. The purpose of bail is to ensure that a party will show up in court, so to speak. And the reason why bail tends to go the amount of bail tends to go hand in hand with the severity of the crime is the argument that the more severe the crime, the less likely someone is to show up to court. but bail is not punishment under our system of law. That being said, the process of bail, the administration of bail to offenders, and there's been much written on this by folks who are just really great scholars, has not been administered fairly. So in other words, you know, if you have a total $100 to your name, then the argument is $1 of bail should be enough to ensure you show up to court. But often we see that folks who are indigent and so forth are penalized rather harshly by the system of bail. So the quick answer is obviously that the purpose of bail is to ensure that the person shows up to court, not for punishment. And so while the crime is heinous, you know, these police officers, you know, I'm not going to make an argument whether they should have even been given bail, but where are they going to go to hide, right? They can't flee the country. Their faces are plastered all over the newspapers and the media, and people are sitting on their homes. They probably can't even open their front door without reporters and so forth jumping on them. So basically, they're not going anywhere.
Thank you.
Can I also just add that it's a constitutional right. People have a constitutional right to bail. I think the question was also, I agree with Professor Burkhalter, it's obviously to incentivize, and that's based on the amount of bail depending on the severity of the crime, but it is a constitutional right. What is actually interesting in what's happening in the United States right now is the police officers have been granted bail in these murders. But I don't know if people know about these two lawyers in New York who threw Molotov cocktails into an empty police van. They've been denied bail because the prosecutors have argued that they are a threat to society and so. But I think I don't comment on the you know, obviously the legality and the validity of the actions of these two lawyers. But it is interesting that they are denied bail, but the officers who kill African American men with videotape, with video recordings going, are allowed bail.
May I just add in just one tangential issue here? So this has come out in the paper between today and yesterday that the prison or jail, actually, because they haven't been sentenced yet, where these police officers are being held, who are still being held.
Yes.
The Board of Corrections or whoever's in charge there issued an edict that no Black correction officers should be responsible for their care. Only white correction officers, because they were fearful that these Black correction officers might harm them. So it's just amazing. So does that mean that no white correction officer should ever be responsible for the care of a Black person? It's just absurd. And apparently these correction officers have sued. So this, again, the re-victimization, I think the bail is a great question. This issue with the correction officers, we always see this. When folks are harmed at the hands of the police, Black folks, they are re-victimized over and over and over and over again.
Can I just make a point I forgot to note on the police union question that a 2018 study done by some researchers at Oxford of the 100 largest American cities found that the extent of protections in police contracts was directly and positively correlated with police violence and other abuses against citizens, right? So the collective bargaining power that the unions have is a power that the unions themselves have used to advance and immunize police officers from engaging in police criminality and getting away with it.
Thank you. I'm going to try and pull, I'm not necessarily going to be able to ask all the questions, but I'm going to try and pull some together that are related. There's a question here specifically for Tanzil about the relationship between colonialism, imperialism, and international law and the impact on domestic policing and domestic policies. And then I think, because I think at some level, you know, there is some historical relationship. And then I'd like the panel to also consider the question about, you know, the ideology is, and the message has been that there are higher rates of Black criminality, and therefore what do the police do? How should they respond to the apparently higher levels of criminality in minority and Black communities? Now, I'm putting a big question mark over that one, obviously. So if those two could be addressed at the same time, so perhaps Tanzil, and then the rest of the panel can come back on the second point.
Yes, thank you. So on the first question, I think one of the main similarities is that, like international law, the domestic legal system is also invested in the production of difference, of othering, racialization being one of them. So you can have seemingly neutral, objective laws which don't pick out any particular community, but obviously laws, a legal system, a legal order is not a kind of a transcendent normative system and necessarily absorbs the ways in which that society produces difference. So international law is similarly invested in this production of difference. It's what Anthony Angie calls the dynamic of difference, between an enlightened West and other countries in the global South which fall short of a particular standard. And that production, that actual production of difference warrants some kind of policing. And I think we see at the domestic level a similar production of difference we would call, racialization. On the issue of there being higher levels of criminality in communities racialized as Black or Asian, I mean, that's kind of, it's just patently and empirically false. And I want to bring your attention to a report that was published by Dr. Patrick Williams and Rebecca Clark that they did on the gangs matrix and serious youth violence. And what they found is that the majority of serious youth violence is actually committed by young white men. I think it's around about 85%, yet represented on the gangs matrix. And so the idea that criminality is more rampant within these particular communities is empirically false. And I also made a reference to a report by the Drugs Charity Release. Young Black people are disproportionately stop and search for alleged drug offences, even though they take drugs less than their white counterparts. So these kinds of myths don't hold up, firstly, to any kind of empirical scrutiny.
Thanks, Tanzil. Any other members of the panel want to respond to any of those points? Because if not, and I think that was a very compelling argument, Tanzil, thank you. I think that there are a range of questions that really are about what to do next. What do people do? How do white people support their Black and people of colour colleagues and compatriots? And how do we move forward in keeping and maintaining pressure on reforming or defunding the institutions that are responsible for this extraordinary level of violence against the Black community and the community of colour? So perhaps if we could have final comments from the panel on actually ways forward, because I think that's very much what I'm seeing in some of the questions about how, what kind of action should we be taking?
I'd like.
Well, I don't want.
I'm sorry. I'm willing to address that question, but I do want to say something about this last point about criminality and criminal misconduct in Black and brown communities, because we learned in the last couple of years that in New York City, police officers, even after it had been outlawed, police officers were being told at the command level that they had to meet a quota of a certain number of arrests. And when you're already over-policing Black and brown communities, it should come as no surprise that you're going to have a high number of arrests of people in those communities if there's an informal quota, even if it's an illegal quota, to make a certain number of arrests. And the criminality argument often doesn't disaggregate race and class. And the whole point that I've been trying to make is that the kinds of problems that lead people to engage in the conduct that is defined as criminal are problems that should be addressed by other social policies and by other actors besides the police. So this is a complex problem, and it seems to me that the reduction of the question to the issue of whether Blacks or Latinos, say in the US, commit more crimes is itself symptomatic of the over-identification of criminality with Blackness, which has a long pedigree in this country that dates back indeed to slavery, and of which the current moment of the criminalization of entire areas of cities and towns because of the skin color of the people who live in them is a contemporary expression.
I wonder if I could just add, I agree with Kendall. It's not just actually a problem in the United States. Blackness as criminalized was a feature of apartheid South Africa too. And I thought the question about colonialism and imperialism also, has resonance in South Africa. But I wanted to respond to this question of the rates of crime and criminality in Black communities. The facts, if you look at the United States and mass shootings, for example, the number of people who are killed in violent crimes in the United States, disproportionately, they are white males who are doing this. Those communities, you don't see the same level of animus and hostility in those communities. And even just lately, during the pandemic, you saw these gun-wielding protesters on the steps of state legislatures in Michigan, for example, with guns. And the police, their response to those protesters compared to the peaceful protesters very often. So it is, it is as a crock, the argument, because it's about unequal policing, and it's also about this criminalizing of Blackness, as Professor Thomas mentioned earlier, or maybe Professor Burkhalter, driving while Black, eating while Black, breathing while Black. This is some of the problems. So I think it's a spurious argument.
If I might, I'll interject and I'll provide my closing remarks that, and because the two go hand in hand. And I believe when we ask what can we do for those who are unfamiliar with Black communities, Black culture throughout the world, educate yourself. Because all you have to rely on, or all folks have to rely on, is what they may see on the local news or so forth. So what we get from the media with regards to Black culture is extremely negative. And it just, once again, agreeing with Professor Thomas and Professor Andrews, it just plays into this concept that there is a higher level of criminality and murder and everything else in Black communities. And not only is there a higher level, but Black communities don't mind that they don't want the laws enforced. They don't want to live safely and so forth. So that's one. It's just and Professor Thomas nailed it right on the head with the understanding the intertwining of all the other issues, socio-economic factors that play into this. Just to look at it, and I hate when I see statistics are thrown out that in this precinct there are so-and-so robberies, so-and-so this crime, so-and-so that crime. Well, that can't possibly tell the whole story. So one, educate yourself. And two, this might be a little bit controversial, but I'm leery of knee-jerk reactions, right? So, we see corporations throwing money at the problem. Oh, I'm going to give X amount of dollars to Black Lives Matter. I'm going to do it today. I'm going to do this. We passed a legislation out banning chokeholds. So what? We passed the legislation banning chokeholds. I think it was last week here in New York. And then just over the weekend, a police officer was suspended. The jury is still out on whether or not he should be charged for crime, whatever the case, but he was suspended for using a chokehold. So these knee-jerk reactions tend to not have staying power. This is the time, certainly I want to see direct action and action that is swift, but I also would encourage folks to be thoughtful about the action that they take, the action that they promote. Luckily, the world was full of everyone that's participating in this webinar. We just wouldn't even have to discuss it, because by virtue of who you are thoughtful in your actions. But I would, somebody else mentioned there's a decision, I read it recently, I'm so sorry, the name escapes me. There was a decision about qualified immunity. And I agree with the person that chimed in. It's a horrible decision. So educating yourself on these legal decisions that are tying the hands of the public and really not allowing us to move forward is just so important. So those are my two big takeaways. Is Graham v. Connor, by the way, which is just a horrible decision. And thank you for sending that in. So education and being weary of knee-jerk reactions and continued conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Kirk. And now I'm going to, we're going to wind up because we are just over time, but I'm going to start with Tanzil and move to Kendall and finally to Penny before we do actually close for their final comments, please. Tanzil?
I don't really want to add. Yes, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sort of, yes.
Can you hear me?
Perhaps turn your video off.
Maybe, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I don't really want to add much to what.
Okay, I mean, we can't hear you, Tanzil, very well anyway.
The panelists have said, other than.
Yes?
I think we may have lost him.
No, I think we've lost Tanzil again. So I think we'll move now to you, Kendall. Thank you.
All right. Let me just say, Tanzil, I hope you hear this. I thought your presentation was just brilliant, and I look forward to talking with you in greater detail on some other platform about comparative perspectives, because I'm thinking in my own work not only about the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, but also the Black Lives Matter movement in Brazil, where racialization and criminalization of Black and brown populations is central to the project of the racial state there. But I will close by simply recommending to your reading a report from 2017 called Freedom to Thrive, Reimagining Safety and Community in Our Communities, which offers a blueprint for a community-based and community-controlled approach to safety and security that does not rely on police and on policing. All the evidence suggests, and this is a large body of research, all the evidence on crime reduction suggests that reallocating resources on the front end to things like drug treatments, interventions with at-risk families, school completion programs and literacy programs, programs to address food insecurity and the like, have a huge payoff on the back end with respect to the incidence of harmful behaviors that we currently address through policing. So I think that the promise and the possibility of this moment for a paradigm shift, not just from police, but to policing. And here I'll say, I support in theory the observation that Professor Burkhalter, or the suggestion that Professor Burkhalter made earlier about reimagining the precinct. But I think we need civilian control, not a civilian police partnership, because the police have guns, and we have a history of a military model and a militarization of the police. Moreover, in the current moment, the police have financialized policing so that extracting wealth from Black and brown communities through fines and the like, I'm thinking of the Ferguson report, has actually become a source of revenue for police departments in this era of neoliberal austerity. So I'm all for reimagining, but I think we need to reimagine in a way that confers priority and primacy to the needs of communities as those communities express them, and do not think that policing is inevitable or eternal rather. It has a history, and in the same way it emerged, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with imagining the disappearance of policing as we know it.
Thank you very much. Penny.
Thank you. Sorry, so I started on a very hopeful note, but I want to share something that's not so hopeful. In a society in which there was a real imagining of a transformative police force, and in South Africa in 1994, with the election and the presidency of Nelson Mandela, there more money, more resources, more imagination went into transforming the South African police and transforming it into the South African police services. There were community policing forums. There was a range of activities and strategies and plans. Well, I'm here to tell you in 2021 that much of those came to naught. South Africa, the crime rate is a problem. People do not feel safe. The police, in fact, are in many ways more violent than they were during the apartheid era. I agree with Professor Thomas that this is about a range of resources, will, and so on. But the interventions, it requires socioeconomic interventions, psychological, etc., etc. I wish I could say that the one place that I loved dearly was where this experiment would have worked. It didn't. So it's just to say that, yes, we've got to reimagine, we've got to transform, but we've got to be sure that what we want at the end actually transpires. And in South Africa, that's just not been the case, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Penny, and thank you very much, panelists, for a really thought-provoking round table. I think as a critical criminologist, we were trained and we understood very clearly that there is no relationship between policing and crime control. And I think that we really do need to go back to the history books to understand the origins of policing in all our societies, to understand that that is not where the solutions lie. The criminal justice process is not a site for resolving any of the problems that we've discussed today. In fact, you've all mentioned many of the resources, and it's probably about a massive restructuring of our society as we know it. But on that note, I do want to thank you all very, very much for this fabulous panel. Thank you for making yourselves available at this time of the morning. Thank you everybody who has attended online. It's not easy, but I think it was an incredibly successful round table, and I'm very, very grateful for everybody for appearing. So thank you all. We will hopefully have more events of this order. I think we need to keep this conversation going. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Penny, and my fellow panelists.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully I'll be in touch in some time, but thanks very much for joining us.
I'll reach out to you.
That'll be fantastic, Kendall. Thank you very much.